So far in these videos, we've covered most of the ingredients that go into the concoction of American roots music. You can trace the lineage from field hollers to spirituals to gospel to soul music, or you could trace a parallel line from field hollers to ragtime to blues to jazz. And either way, you get a convergence at rock and roll, which was a crossover staple that unquestionably accelerated the process of American integration and civil rights, which had largely stagnated between the Civil War and World War II. However, so far we've mostly covered traditions which originate in the history of Black Southerners. And of course, no retelling of the story would be complete without introducing the similarly deep lineage of music considered traditional by white Americans across the country. Now notice I've stopped short of calling anything white music or music invented by white Americans, because the influences from Black Americans go so deep in the country's history that it's likely that no such form of exclusively European-influenced music meaningfully existed at any point in American history. But of course, that more European-influenced side of the equation mostly consists of country music, which we'll cover today through a key touchstone in the history of country music with Will the Circle Be Unbroken by Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Where words like blues and spirituals got applied to an enormous array of music developed by Black Southerners, a similarly diverse array of regional variations of music primarily played by white Americans became known as old-time music. Old-time music primarily started as dances, set to music by a singular fiddle player who would also act as a caller. The banjo was next to get added, an instrument which unquestionably developed based on the cultural memory of enslaved people brought to the United States from Africa. Guitar, mandolin, double bass, and dobro would be next to be added, and their addition would trigger an evolution from old-time music into the next form of music considered traditional by white Americans. And this style would remain popular well into the recording era, bluegrass. And bluegrass would go on to differentiate itself further by bringing in additional influences from blues and jazz through its infatuation with virtuosic solos. Now back to old-time music. The most significant influences were from folk music from the British Isles and Western continental Europe, from Native Americans, primarily in the harmonies, and from Africa, primarily in the vocal performances, in the use of the banjo, through the dance styles, and many other elements. Notably, when compared to later forms of music like bluegrass, old-time music mostly featured compositions where the full band all played the same melody, or where one instrument played the melody and the rest played backgrounds to support it. Now moving on to bluegrass. It made several innovations on its own, in addition to a few more influences brought over from blues and jazz, like we discussed before, solos, and also complex chord progressions. Bluegrass would focus on a backbeat and an anticipation of the upcoming beat, giving it a much faster feel than the blues, whose swing style would always play behind the beat. The backbeat would revolutionize American music all the way through the rock and roll era. It's unclear which tradition actually created the backbeat, but bluegrass helped cement its commanding position in American music. Country music gained its own identity the second that bluegrass irreversibly changed the landscape of old-time music, with country being a more heterodox form that bent the lines between old-time, bluegrass, blues, and gospel. Country music starts at that moment of expanded instrumentation that we talked about when bluegrass was invented, and adds in a bunch of other influences, like from Mexico and Hawaii, which brought its iconic pedal steel guitar, which completed the set of source material which created country music. Immediately, an industry sprang up around a radio show in Nashville called the Grand Ole Opry in 1925, broadcast on the gargantuan WSM AM radio station, which could be heard all over the United States and Canada at night thanks to Nashville's central location. The interwar era, which famously centered on Hank Williams Sr., solidified country culture and the country music canon. And of course, that electric, poppy, rock-inspired style would take over the scene by the 1970s. It was called the Nashville Sound, and that is the direct ancestor of the pop country music that we all know and love today. Old-time music would hit a major resurgence thanks to the influence of the Seeger family in New York City in the 1940s. Their archival work, accumulating folk music from Americans of all regions and backgrounds, caught the attention of a growing movement of artsy baby boomers. The old-timey revival went hand in hand with the hippie era, spawning roots bands on the West Coast, largely disconnected from the continuous tradition of old time, and thus the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band was formed, a collective in Long Beach, California in 1966, playing American roots music in the context of the hippie fascination with all things folk. But unlike other bands of the time, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band would take a particular interest in the history of country music. This album marked a key moment of integration between the country establishment and the hippie alternative culture. Until this point, the country music's old guard had erected a barrier between themselves and this new wave of alternative art. apart, mostly dividing Nashville's scene and industry from the Californian scene and industry. By including trusted members of the Nashville music world, like Roy Acuff and Maybelle Carter, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band were able to form a previously unthinkable bond on this record. This is one of the earliest examples of self-consciously traditionalist country music, in opposition to the popifying Nashville sound. You can essentially think of this album as a coup, carried out by an alliance between alternative kids and Nashville old heads against the suits running the city's studio system. Songwriting-wise, this record has a couple original songs, but most of what we're hearing either comes from deep within the American folk tradition, or it was already a popular country standard, or they were songs written by the creative partners on the record who had already made their name in the scene. I think one thing that just jumps off the page with this record is a certain stoic tragedy. By the time this album had came out, the era that produced music like this had already passed. Any attempt at recreating that foregone culture would lead to a perversion at worst, or just a pathetic imitation at best. But nevertheless, these singers continue on with their tunes. And it's not for any nefarious reason, it's just because that's just what they do. This is a window into creativity as a process that's just natural to the human person, like eating or sleeping. It's one attuned to individual tastes, so much so that the individual tastes mandate exactly how and why we do it. You should always create the way that you just do, whether the world has moved on from your style or not. This album also deals with the darkness inherent in country music in an extremely strange way. As you can see by the symbolism on the cover, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band seemed intent on reproducing literally everything that they found in the South wholesale without any edits at all. Racist violence and all. Likewise, songs about rural angst, working class alienation, and religious fervor all appear here in strikingly passionate fashion. Of course, it was the archival spirit of the age that mandated this sort of transparent treatment, but that doesn't make it feel any less weird, especially with our sensibilities today. It's hard to imagine any of these individual songs appearing on a record that had something else to say other than a specifically pointed message. You know, like one against capitalism, in favor of Protestant Christianity, or some other specific issue. And it's especially unthinkable to imagine an album today reproducing an image of a hate symbol on its cover just because that's the sort of thing that the artist thinks that the people they're paying homage to would have done. But despite all the issues with this uncritical reproduction of history, it's almost refreshing to see honesty like this. Now, the only reason it feels that way is because today we're seeing a movement of people picking up the pieces of old-time music and traditional country music, blowing straight past that dark history and creating something sanitized and accessible to a broad audience. It's not like we need country music to have sectarian hate or anti-capitalist militancy in order to be authentic, but completely divorcing the appreciation of a time and place from an acknowledgement of its deep systemic injustice just feels incomplete. In reality, the people who created these songs had an extremely complicated place in society. They were, of course, oppressed at the hands of mining operations and large-scale landowners, while in turn they were viciously oppressing a racialized minority. Maybe this straightforward retelling was necessary in order to extend an olive branch between Nashville and LA or something. But all of this begs the question, is this album an elaborate cosplay, or is it the last gasp of a truly authentic traditional country voice? We could get into the cat chasing its own tail with all sorts of questions about postmodern reality, references, cultural production. Is this a hyper-real object, or is there anything real to be reproduced here at all? Suffice to say, this album is an enigma, and it's really hard to say anything else more succinct about it than that. But there is something here that I think this album captures better than just about anything else could. And it's that there was a time where the American performer was playing mostly for their community. That could be a community on a lot of scales, either literally for people on their front porch, or on a radio station broadcasting to almost identical front porches all across the continent. But that era's over. The genie won't ever go back into the bottle, and after World War II, the United States was thrust into a global audience. Even if you get those same people from that earlier era, playing the same songs, in the same studios, you're going to get something inexplicably haunted, uncomfortable, and strange. But of course, there's beauty in the discomfort, and maybe that beauty is the only sort of beauty we're still capable of making with this art form. Thank you for watching.